Boldwood presents The Stepson, written by Diane Saxon and read by Charlotte Worthing. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. To all of those who have a skeleton in their family closet. Chapter 1. Present day, Tuesday 6th of June, 3:23 a.m. Sandra Leavesley twitched the curtains open a touch and peeped with one eye through the narrow gap she'd created. Her fingers gripped the material, ready to stitch the edges closed again with the speed of an electric sewing machine. A car squatted on her drive. The orange glow from a distant streetlight highlighted a dull bloom on paintwork, which had possibly been red at one time, and gave a hint to how old it was. The engine rumbled for another moment, and then stuttered a gusty death rattle before quivering into silence. Sandra let out a quiet breath, almost fearful she could be heard, fairly certain she couldn't be seen, though, as she'd sneaked through on stealthy toes in the pitch black, certain of her way around the house she'd lived in for 30 years, even in the dark. Motionless, she waited. Nothing happened. No one moved. The car doors remained closed. In the dim orange glow, she could almost believe it was empty. Abandoned. Sandra knew better. She narrowed her eyes to zero in on any movement. Nothing. Except the vague definition of a pair of hands casually resting on the steering wheel. One finger moved. Tapped. The soft cloud of her warm breath puffed over the chilled window to blur the image. She jerked her face away from the narrow gap, fear gripping her. Heart racing, she pressed the curtains closed and sank back on her haunches. The soft mattress gave under her slight weight, and she pushed the palms of her hands down to steady herself. The pattern of intertwining pink roses and olive green leaves on the curtains wavered before her tear-filled eyes. What was she to do? What would Henry have done? Henry, her husband of 32 years, who'd always been there. Her rock. When she fell apart, he'd always stayed solid. She listened for footfall up to her front door, the quiet crunch of leather on gravel and dried brown leaves that had whipped up in the autumn in piles along the edge of the drive and still resided there as winter gave way to spring, and then teetered on the edge of summer. Leaves Henry would normally have got the leaf blower on. That had been his job. The garden, the drive, the cars. All abandoned recently. She waited for the doorbell to ring. Prayed it wouldn't. Sandra edged back off the bed and pushed to her feet. She glanced at the clock radio on her bedside table. 3:25 a.m. The time she woke most nights since Henry had gone. Not so much hormones kicking in. They'd almost subsided, except for the occasional rev as they tried to start up, sending sharp tingles and hot flushes. These days, it was more the scrape of guilt, scratching the surface in dreams of dread and fear that disturbed her. Fear that surfaced at her weakest moments. Tonight, it had been the dull throb of that engine on her driveway, sending a soft vibration through their 1960s house to disturb the light sleep she hovered on the edge of. She checked the clock again. 3:26 a.m. Too early to phone her daughter. She only lived a 10-minute drive away, one of the new builds near Trench Lock. It was so convenient for both of them. Usually. Lorraine was going to think she'd gone mad. She'd seen the sideways glances her daughter cast when she thought Sandra wasn't watching. Concern dappled the love in her daughter's eyes. Ever since Henry had died, Lorraine's dad. Sandra covered her mouth with both hands and squeezed her eyes closed to try to block out the memory. But it forced its way in. His dad. The creak of a car door swinging wide on rusted hinges halted her thoughts. Oh no. Her breathing quickened. He's coming. Sandra reached for the phone in her dressing gown pocket, the one she'd slipped in when she'd gone to investigate. She'd known this day would come. Footsteps approached the front door with the quiet grind of pebbles beneath a heavy sole. Terror gripped her as she hovered a shaking finger above her daughter's number. The footsteps halted. Sandra held her breath, not daring to take another peek. Would he think twice? Would he go away? It was him. It had to be. Who else would turn up at this time of night uninvited? Her heart quickened with a sickening thought, one that slammed in to haunt her as she waited for the knock at the door, the bell to ring. What if he didn't need to ring the doorbell? What if he had a key? She let out a quiet whimper. Oh, God. She'd bet her life he had a key. How stupid. She should have had the locks changed when Henry died. She'd never given it a thought, too absorbed in her own guilt and grief to care, to be aware. Her tongue thickened in her throat, so she could barely swallow as the phone dialed through 2, 3, 4 times. Hello? A gravelly whisper. Her daughter wouldn't want to wake the children. Sandra didn't want to either. But who else did she have? No one. Lorraine? Mum? The soft shuffle of bedding as she imagined Lorraine bolting up in bed. What's wrong? The edge of panic crept into her daughter's voice. He's here. What? Speak up. I can't hear you. Irritation snapped through the panic. He's here. Who? Your brother. What did you say, Mum? Are you drunk? It wasn't an unreasonable question. She had been on occasion when the pain of loneliness since Henry died had crippled her. She'd phoned Lorraine then, but it had always been at a reasonable hour. She'd cried down the phone. But she'd never been so inebriated that she'd not known when to stop, known when to let her daughter get on with her own life. A life that hadn't taken the easy road either. It was hard. She'd thought herself so independent, so strong. Turned out she was wrong. All that independence and strength had seeped out of her when her husband died, to leave her an empty vessel, bobbing on a sea of loneliness. When Henry had been alive, she'd thought it was her strength that had made them safe. Without him, she knew different. Henry had kept her safe, her and Lorraine and their first grandchild, sweet 5-year-old Sophia. They'd grouped together, a tight-knit unit, when Lorraine's husband had left her 10 weeks before she gave birth to their second child. It seemed he was more enthusiastic about the young, childless woman he'd apparently fallen for at work. One who would probably want children of her own in a few years, so they'd thought, until they learned better. Turned out that she already did. A baby due just a few weeks after little Elijah. Lorraine had seethed. Then she'd settled. Until her dad had died. Grief had smashed into Sandra and Lorraine. Shocking. Unreasonable. Lorraine's ex hadn't bothered to come to Henry's funeral, nor visit his newborn son. Not then, and never since. The tragedies piled up, but the fatal car crash was something Sandra just could not come to terms with. The grief counsellor assured her that it was a natural process. The 7 stages of grief. Time would help, but time wasn't flying on swift wings. It had stuttered to a halt, for her somewhere around shock, denial and anger. There would always be the guilt that riddled her entire being. Guilt would never go. Not so for Lorraine. She'd moved on. With 2 children, she'd had to. She'd managed to override any sense of depression. Nothing like her mother. Sandra had nothing but admiration for her daughter. It didn't mean she could move on, though. She wallowed. She had always wallowed. The horror of a nagging thought scratching at the back of her mind, a thought she was now convinced was correct. She wasn't drunk. Not tonight. She wasn't paranoid. Paranoia held its basis on a rampant imagination. Her conviction wasn't imagination. She was right. Henry's car crash hadn't been an accident, nor had it been a moment of distraction. She knew that. She'd believed otherwise at first, full of horror at her own actions. The rising panic dissolved into acceptance. There was nothing she could do for herself, but she could protect her daughter and grandchildren. Her mind snapped into focus. Listen very carefully to what I have to tell you. I have little time, so just believe me when I say you and the children are in danger. What? Mum? I don't understand. Quiet. Listen. Your dad was first. Now it's me. I'm so scared, but mostly for you and the children. Because once I'm gone, you'll be next. Chapter 2. 15 minutes since phone call. The sense of unease about her mum exploded in a cloud of confusion and terror. Was she drunk? She'd not sounded it. Her words hadn't been slurred like they'd been a couple of weeks ago, when she'd called with a tearful outpouring of anger and denial. The natural responses to her dad's death, according to the counsellor. Eventually she would move on, settle on acceptance. That's what the woman had told them. Sadly, her mum didn't appear to be able to move on. She was stuck on repeat, going round and round. Numb by the time she hung up, Lorraine swung her legs out of bed. She sat for a long moment in the silence, listening to Elijah's soft breaths. Lorraine stared at her mobile phone. Her mum had one. She'd used it tonight, but she normally insisted on using the landline, declaring it had much better reception. So where had she been when she'd phoned? The landline was in her mum's bedroom and the living room. She'd normally reach for that. She rubbed shaky fingers across her lips. Should she call the police? Her mum hadn't said she should. She just insisted Lorraine listen. Listen to something incredible. Unbelievable. She might have listened, but it was garbled and confused, and Lorraine truly wondered if her mum hadn't ingested some hallucinogenic. Perhaps the doctor had prescribed something stronger for her mum's depression. Maybe mixed with a glass of wine, it hadn't suited her. This hadn't seemed like depression, but a manic episode. Could you call someone for that? The counsellor would know. Lorraine glanced at the time. 3:40 a.m. Her chest ached with holding in the terror. She couldn't call at that time of the morning. It wasn't an emergency service. The counsellor probably only worked 9 till 5. Was this an emergency, though? Enough to call 999? What was her mum talking about? A brother? Lorraine didn't have any siblings, nor did her mum, so why would she talk about a brother? Nor one of her uncles on her dad's side. To her knowledge, he never kept in contact with them. Should she call someone other than the emergency services? But who? She came to her feet and padded silently across the room in a practiced move so that she didn't wake her baby boy in his cot by the window. Her lowered voice on the call hadn't woken him, nor the gentle buzz of the phone by her bedside that had her instantly awake, but the sharp creak of a floorboard would. If it did, that would be it for the night. No more sleeping. He wasn't a bad sleeper, but once he'd had 4 hours, he was a supercharged dynamo, ready to play. If she left him undisturbed, he still woke supercharged, but more tolerant and happier. Not that it mattered. She was never going back to sleep now, not with everything her mum had said churning around in her mind. Frankly, she was surprised she hadn't woken Elijah, her voice bordering on a hysterical hiss. She glanced at the digital toothbrush timer above the sink as she sat on the toilet and emptied her bladder. Only 3:50 a.m. What was she supposed to do? Was her mum okay? Elbows on knees, she buried her face in her hands, desperate worry snaking through her. Without any backup, she could hardly swing around to her mum's to check on her. She couldn't leave the children in the house alone, even if it was only for a short while. Her mum lived a 10-minute drive away, but that hardly mattered. She had no idea how long she'd be there once she arrived. Nor could she wake them both and take them with her. It wasn't fair on either of them. Sophia was at the age where anything out of routine would make her anxious. That was the knock-on effect of her dad leaving without a word. In any case, if she woke her now, Sophia was going to be exhausted and naggy by school time. Lorraine stood, once she'd finished on the loo, letting her nightshirt fall back down her thighs as she twisted around and almost flushed the toilet. At the last moment, she hesitated, her hand hovering above the button on the top of the tank. The sound would wake Elijah. She hated not to flush the toilet, but occasionally it wouldn't harm. She'd do it when they were all awake and squirt some bleach around the rim. She tiptoed back into the bedroom and stared at the shadowed face of her son. His lips made a soft, suckling noise as he slept on. Perhaps the smell of her subconsciously disturbed him, reminding him that his food source was close at hand. What if she called Simon? Would he help? Unlikely. He'd not even wanted to see his own son. He'd not bothered with Sophia either, leaving her little girl in a state of complete uncertainty. Lorraine had needed to take him to court to get any kind of child support for Sophia. She'd have to do it again for Elijah. She might have been stupid not realizing her husband was having an affair, but the other woman was stupider still for believing him when he said he wasn't sleeping with his wife, the one who was quite evidently pregnant when Lorraine went around to confront his new girlfriend, who turned out not to be that new. Funny how it was Lorraine who'd lost all her friends when they split up. Fear that she might lean on them, maybe. Foist her children on them with tears of self-pity. There was no one she could call. No one who was close enough to drop everything at, she glanced at the clock again, 4 a.m, and dash around to help out. Her neighbours hadn't been the same since Simon had left. He'd always been the one to socialise with the 3 other couples they lived near. 2 of them younger, without children, and then there was Doreen and Keith Stroman. Both too frail and aged to ask. They were always lovely enough to take in the post, but that was probably as much as Lorraine could expect of them. Certainly they wouldn't know how to handle the children. Their own children were grown men now, whose visits were few and far between. She'd barely spoken with the girls from work since she went on maternity. There was nothing much to say. She really didn't want all those coy looks and pity-filled speeches once they found out her husband had left. She hated the idea of being gossiped about, so she'd told no one there that Simon had left. She'd kept to herself and put off any visits to her house. Where had that got her, though? She had no backup, no one. She'd always relied on her mum and dad. Her dad was no longer there, and her mum, it appeared, had lost her mind. Had she really? Was she sick? Lorraine chewed on the side of her thumbnail. Was her mum sick in the head? Did she need help? Urgent help? It was all a bit melodramatic to call an ambulance, wasn't it? What would she say? Hi, my mum's rambling like a mad person. Words I really don't understand falling from her mouth. Yes, she's depressed. No, she's not suicidal. Is she? As time ticked by, she stared at the phone in her hand. 4:22 a.m. Her mum wasn't suicidal. Definitely. But there was something really wrong. She hit her mum's number and let the phone ring out, turning the volume down and holding the phone close to her ear so Elijah didn't wake. Her fingers trembled as it went to answer phone at her mum's end. Lorraine paced back to the bathroom and lowered herself onto the toilet seat, the chill of it soaking through her thin nightshirt and sending her skin icy. She shivered this time as she dialed her mum's landline, not through the cold, but from fear, as it gripped her. Her dad's car accident had been just that. An accident. Hadn't it? That's not what her mum seemed to be saying. Her mum wasn't in any danger. Was she? And what about Lorraine? Was she in danger herself? And the kids? It made absolutely no sense. The landline went to answer phone too. Mum? Mum? Pick up, will you? You've got me desperately worried. Pick up. She waited as the static pricked at her nerves, and then a long tone sounded. Lorraine disconnected. Helpless, she stood up and pulled her dressing gown off the hook on the back of the bathroom door. There was no way she could go back to bed. Worry curdled in her stomach. Her mum was sick. Lorraine needed to get an urgent meds review for her. She tiptoed downstairs in the dark, then turned on the mood lighting in her little kitchenette, keeping it low. She filled the kettle and switched it on, her fingers tapping on the bench as she listened to the shushing noise getting louder as it came to the boil. As she sat at the small table in her living room, her mug of tea cupped in her hands, her logical mind kicked in. Her mum must have gone back to bed. She was asleep. She had to be. The tirade she'd had on the phone had worn her out. Otherwise, she would have answered when Lorraine called back. Lorraine sipped at her tea, wide awake. Thoughts tumbled over in her mind, stumbling over each other, confusion overlaying all of them like a thick coat of dust. If she got dressed now, organised things, fed Elijah and changed him, she could drop Sophia off at the before-school club when it opened at 7:30 a.m. and then go straight around to her mum's. She was supposed to pre-book the club, but they'd understand if she explained her mum was ill. Perhaps they needed to make a doctor's appointment, find out what was going on in her mum's head. Because whatever it wasn't right. She finished her drink and glanced at the time. Almost 5 a.m. No matter how hard she'd tried to be rational, The notion that her mum was right still niggled. Her words sounding in Lorraine's ears. "I'm so scared, but mostly for you and the children. Because once I'm gone, you'll be next." Chapter 3. 4 hours 15 minutes since phone call. Lorraine hitched Elijah higher up her hip as she juggled with the bunch of keys, grasping the one to her mum's front door and then jamming it into the lock. She pressed the doorbell at the same time, just to give her mum warning someone was there. She didn't need her dying of a heart attack because she wasn't expecting Lorraine at this time of the morning. Only 7:45 a.m., Lorraine had managed to dump Sophia and run with the child barely even aware she was leaving, as Sophia headed straight for the sandpit to bag the best sieve and shovel before the other children arrived. Karen, the team leader, had greeted them with a little confusion, which soon turned to sympathy, as Lorraine quickly explained that her mum was ill and she needed to get to her. It wasn't exactly a lie, but she didn't need to divulge the whole truth. Lorraine swung the front door wide, removed the key, and slipped the bunch of them into her cardigan pocket. She'd yanked her coat off and slung it on the front seat of her car after she'd dropped Sophia off. Mild compared to the weather lately. She'd overdressed. "Mum?" The unnatural stillness could just be her imagination, but the air pressed heavy with it. Used to seeing her mum immediately, often with the front door wide once she heard Lorraine's car draw up. A vague suspicion that all wasn't well nagged. Even if she wasn't at the door, she'd be up, showered, dressed, and making a cup of tea. Lorraine glanced at the alarm box, knowing that it wasn't set. Her mum and dad had never used the alarm. They didn't like the thought of disturbing the neighbours if it went off accidentally. That was the kind of people they were. Private, never wanted to draw attention to themselves. Naive, believing they'd never be broken into just because they never had been. Yet, she'd inherited that trait from them, which was why she had no one to turn to now. "Mum?" She leaned her backside against the door and pushed it closed, the loud click of the deadlock filling the silence as she raised her head and stared up the flight of stairs, expecting to see her mum at the top of them, a look of confusion on her face and asking what Lorraine was doing there so early. "Mum? Hiya! It's me. Are you up?" Silence sent a flutter of anxiety through Lorraine's stomach. Oh, God. She gave Elijah a reassuring squeeze, as though he was the one who needed comfort. There was nothing. Not just a lack of sound, but a decided emptiness. No radio, no washing machine, no movement. Had she made a serious mistake, not calling for help the night before? Lorraine made her way from the short hallway to the door on her left, into her mum's living room. A living room not only empty, but cloaked in darkness. One-handed, Lorraine tugged back heavy pattern curtains her mum would normally have opened by now. The niggling anxiety turned into a kernel of fear, as pale sunshine dappled through windows Lorraine had failed to notice her mum hadn't cleaned lately. A fastidious woman normally. Lorraine balked at the fact she'd not noticed her mum slipping before she fell. She circled around, her gaze touching on the furniture, the surfaces, checking if there were more signs she'd missed. A tall bookcase in stained oak served as a partial dividing wall between the sitting room, with its brown leather settee and matching wingback chair her dad had always commandeered. A chair that managed to make her heart squeeze at its barrenness. Perhaps that was it. The absence of not only her mum, but her dad too. A room charged with emptiness. Lorraine smoothed her hand over her little boy's bare arm. He'd felt warm, too, earlier, but his skin had cooled now. She made her way through to the connecting dining room, with its impeccable neatness, as her mum barely ever used it. Only when Lorraine and the kids visited for midweek dinner and Sunday lunch did the room get used. Last night's newspaper lay open, the crossword almost finished. 3 clues not yet completed. An inch of blood-red wine, probably a Syrah, her mum's preference of late, sat heavy and dark in the bottom of the glass next to the open pages. Had she had too much? Had it conflicted with her medication? Lorraine pulled the high chair her mum had bought when Sophia was a baby away from the table and slipped Elijah into it. She shrugged his changing bag from her shoulder and grabbed out a teething ring before the whinge rose in his throat. His arms and legs thrashed with excitement as she pulled his floppy white toy rabbit out and snuggled it against his chest, while she blew soft raspberries at him. She slipped his arms through a cardigan, one at a time, so quick he barely noticed. Contented gurgles accompanied drool as it slithered from around the teether he'd shoved into his mouth. A happy child. It didn't take much to appease him, as long as she kept him entertained. She smoothed a hand over his dark hair. "I won't be a minute, Munchkin." She considered reaching for the remote control to turn on the TV in the sitting room, but decided against it, in case it masked any other sounds in the house. Sounds she was straining to catch. With one last glance at her son, she left him in the living room and sprinted up the stairs, a pain that refused to go away, tightening her chest. "Mum?" She kept her voice light and airy, but concern fluttered, the panic of a moth's wing in her stomach. Was her mum still asleep? Surely not. Never in her entire life had Lorraine known her mum to sleep in. She should be up, dressed, drinking tea. All 4 doors from the landing stood wide, as her mum always liked them, to let the light through. Only the light wasn't spilling from the 3 bedrooms and single bathroom. The curtains and blinds were still closed, to leave an eerie grey light shadowing through. Lorraine peered into each room. Her mum would never go out without opening the curtains. Lorraine glided them back and let the light flood in. She stared at her mum's double bed, with the duvet smoothed flat, as though her mum had just stepped out, leaving the bed perfect as she always did. Her slippers missing, though, from under the bedside table. Lorraine placed her hand underneath the duvet, but the sheet was cold. Her mum hadn't just slid out. It looked like the place had been abandoned, like she'd never been there. There was no point calling her mum's name again. She wasn't going to answer. Guilt knocked on the side of mounting terror. She peered into the empty bathroom, fully expecting her mum to be passed out on the floor. Regret and shame formed a hard knot. Her mum had called in the middle of the night. For help. Lorraine had done nothing about it. What was she supposed to have done? Called the police? Paramedics? All based on what assumption? One hysterical phone call. All too melodramatic then. Not so now. Lorraine slipped through to the front bedroom, where Sophia slept when she stayed over with her grandma, the one she'd always considered hers, until her daughter came along and claimed it for herself. They didn't often all stay together at her mum's house. Her mum was supposed to come to her at Christmas this year. Their roles were changing, evolving. Since her dad had died, Lorraine felt a deeper sense of responsibility for the woman who had always been so strong, so independent, but whose health had deteriorated since her husband had gone. Her mental health more than the physical. The imprint of what she assumed were her mum's knees dipped into the centre of the pretty pink unicorn duvet, the matching curtains still shut tight against the pale yellow sunshine. Without leaning on the bed, Lorraine reached over and snapped the curtains open so she could peer out over the driveway, where she'd parked her 3-year-old two-tone Ford Puma with its smart black roof and special edition ruby red body. Lucky she'd bought it when she did, because she couldn't afford a new car now. She'd paid the loan off when Simon had left, with a quiet personal loan from her dad. Interest-free. Her mum had been horrified in case she racked up a load of debts once there was only one salary coming into the house. She still owed the money, but her mum had told her not to worry until she started back to work, which would be imminent, because she couldn't afford to stay off any longer. In the meantime, this car would have to last a number of years yet. She frowned as she looked out at the ordinary day, with people in the street going about their ordinary business. Children in uniform at the school bus stop, the same one she'd stood at when she was that age. There was nothing wrong. And yet everything was. "Where are you, Mum?" Her heart thudded as she gazed out, looking for a familiar figure as people passed by, the vague sound of their voices floating up to her. An explosion of glass shattering split the silence apart. "Elijah!" Lorraine screamed out her son's name as she whirled and ran for the stairs. Chapter 4. 5 hours since phone call. Elijah's screams rent the air in two as Lorraine charged into the living room and skidded to a halt. Face puce with horror, scrunched up as he let out another howl. "What happened, Elijah?" She ran to the high chair, snatching him out to hug him close to the heart almost beating out of her chest. "It's okay. It's okay. Mummy's here. I'm here, baby. I'm here." His legs thrashed against her belly as his spine stiffened. He wedged his arms between them and pushed back against her until her own arms burned with the effort of hanging on to her hysterical child. "Elijah!" Her gaze darted across the small sliding patio doors and then over to the dark wood Welsh dresser and the glitter of hundreds of shards of glass. Elijah's teething ring hovered on the ledge. "Oh no, Elijah!" Her breath held in her chest as the immediate threat melted into the background. There was nothing to fear but her own mum's anger when she found her husband's delicate crystal whiskey glass smashed to smithereens. The heavy base of it broken into unequal thirds, a victim of Elijah's strong left-handed lob. He may become a star cricketer in later life, but right now, he was nothing but trouble. "We are in such a pickle." Lorraine rocked her howling little boy until his sobs petered out into snotty snuffles with the occasional hiccup. "It's okay. Don't worry, Elijah." Lorraine grasped the back of the chair with one hand and pulled it away from the glass shard-littered table. None of it appeared to have sprayed over his high chair. Exhausted, he barely objected as she slid him back into the seat. She dipped her hand into the open changing bag and then whipped it back out again. A pinprick of blood bloomed on her middle finger as she picked out a tiny splinter of glass. "For goodness sake." She drummed up a quick smile as Elijah's plump lips made a downturn. "It's okay, darling." In desperation, she grinned and wondered if that wouldn't upset him more. The image of his mother's face turning feral. "Would you like one of Grandma's biscuits?" Mama. Grandma. She felt the sob in the back of her throat. Oh, Grandma. Elijah reached out a hand and flexed his fingers in a give-me motion. Hold on, Elijah. She whipped through to the kitchen and swiped the biscuit barrel that her mum kept especially for the kids off the bench, just as Elijah's whimpering started up. Mummy's coming. I have Grandma's biscuits. She wrenched the lid off and thrust the tin at Elijah, barely even blinking as he dipped one chubby hand and then the other inside to come out with 3 biscuits. Normally, she would have handed him one. Just one. With a fat tear still hovering on the ledge of his eye, ready to plop over, Lorraine couldn't take the risk. She pushed the lid back on the biscuit tin and forced another wide smile. You eat those, darling, while Mummy sweeps up this. The dustpan and brush under her mum's sink would have to do. Each tinkling laugh of the glass hitting the dustpan made her think of her mum. She didn't care if her mum was going to be angry with her for breaking the glass. She just wanted her back. Lorraine raised her head and stared at the patio doors and frowned. All the curtains and blinds in the house had been closed, except the vertical blinds across the patio doors. They were pulled open. Not all the way, just the width of a person. A person coming in? Or one going out? Chapter 5. 31 years earlier. Sandra forced eyelids, thick with lack of sleep, open, and grunted as she attempted to roll onto her side, until the dull ache in her abdomen turned to a sharp stab, as a quick reminder of the caesarean section she'd undergone 10 days earlier. She listened to her shallow breathing for a moment before reaching out to touch the cold side of the bed where her husband normally slept. She'd been so exhausted from the night's long vigil, with the baby crying, she'd not even heard Henry slide out of bed earlier to sneak off for his first day back at work. She could have done with his help a little longer, but he was up to his eyes in it, with no thought of his wife having undergone a major operation. Work demanded he return. Even more so, she'd wanted to show her support by getting up with him, seeing him off with a wave to reassure him they'd be fine. They would be fine, but she'd not had the energy to move. A long groan huffed from her lips as she edged her way to the side of the bed and then propped herself up on her elbow. It was all very well, Henry suggesting she ask friends to call in, but most of her friends were at work. Besides, all she wanted to do was sleep while the baby did. Not that she had much chance. Not while they had 11-year-old Trevor living with them. That was an unwelcome surprise, if ever there was one. She didn't want to be a bitch. In fact, she'd kept her feelings very much to herself. Just because she hid them didn't mean she didn't have them. 26 weeks into a pregnancy, that had happened somewhat quicker than anticipated. In fact, on their honeymoon, the last thing they'd bargained for was to be saddled with Henry's son from his first marriage, a marriage that ended when Trevor was 10. Uncomfortable with him, even when he only came to stay once a month for the weekend. Sandra barely knew the child. The boy came to see his father, not her. He made that very clear. He barely even acknowledged her existence, despite her best endeavours to engage him. There was a possessiveness to Trevor, an insistence that he get between Sandra and her relatively new husband. The thin end of a wedge becoming insidiously wider. Not that she could blame him. He'd just lost his mum in an accident. He was bound to cling. Somehow, though, Sandra knew it was something far darker than that. It had existed from the moment Henry introduced her to his son. Where she should feel sorry for him, a young boy who'd not long lost his mum, there was a coldness to him. Even when tears tracked down his sallow cheeks, there was something dead in his expression as it met hers over his dad's shoulder. "He's mine. I'm not going to share." His arms would tighten tenaciously around Henry's neck, his thumb childishly poking between his lips. He sent a chill through her when that cold stare turned to ice and he refused to look away. And now she was stuck with him, a man in a child's body, too cynical already, an underlying ripple of malevolence just hovering below the soft surface of innocence. She knew she wasn't alone in her opinion of him. Even his maternal grandparents wouldn't have him during the final 2 weeks of her pregnancy, to give Henry and her a break. Nor did they entertain having Trevor overnight after she'd had her caesarean. Henry would have had to drive an hour each way to pick his son up from them, a factor they used to their own advantage when they said they were too old to travel that far to pick Trevor up from school for a few days. Only a few days. That's all Henry and she had needed while she was in hospital. The child had tagged along with Henry, the simmer of annoyance shimmering in his dark expression as he glared at the little bundle his dad cradled in his arms. The baby, who was getting everyone's attention when he needed it. He'd lost his mum, hadn't he? He had that. It didn't make any difference, though. He'd always been an awkward child. Now he was awkward and sullen. Sandra couldn't even attribute it to him being sad. He was permanently angry. She sighed as she swung her legs over the side of the bed. Despite the heating ticking over on low, she shivered as she padded into the bathroom to relieve herself. The timing had been so wrong. If only she'd not had preeclampsia and needed a caesarean. If only the baby hadn't been 4 weeks early. If only Henry hadn't needed to go back to work at the beginning of half-term, so she was left with an 11-year-old who she could do nothing with, had nothing in common with. She was too exhausted to entertain him. With a bright intelligence, he would soon be bored. Disruptive. He was always disruptive, demanding, attention-seeking. It wasn't as though she could farm him out to someone with kids of his age. She didn't know anyone. He'd not long started at their local school, and she'd barely had time to get to know the parents of his classmates. He'd certainly shown no interest in any of the children in his class. Not yet. A little stab of guilt made her stop. Think again. She needed to be patient. He needed time. It wasn't easy. She washed her hands, pausing with the towel wrapped around them as she cocked her head to one side. Caution igniting a faint flicker of concern in her chest. A sinister hush hung in a thick cloud. Claustrophobic and stifling, so she could barely breathe. Suspicion awakened in her. Sandra dropped the towel into the sink, her breath catching in her throat. Something was wrong. The house was silent. The baby was silent. Trevor was silent. Chapter 6. 6.5 hours since phone call. Lorraine gave the clerk on the front desk of the police station a strained smile. Will they be much longer? The middle-aged man stopped typing up the information she'd briefly given him and peered at her over half-moon glasses that perched halfway down a long, narrow nose. A flicker of confusion passed through his eyes. They? He stroked the hank of fine grey hair back from his wide forehead. They who? The police officer? To look into my mum's disappearance. She jiggled Elijah higher up her hip as the weight of him became a strain. Will the police officer be much longer? The man's brows twitched together. I think you may be getting ahead of yourself, madam. Elijah let out a squeal and shoved 2 dribble-slimed fingers into the corner of Lorraine's mouth, instantly stopping her from replying. She took the child's hand in hers and placed a gentle kiss on his palm before tucking it between them so she could talk uninterrupted. What do you mean? Aware of the stickiness around her mouth, Lorraine dipped her hand into her pocket to retrieve the ever-present tissue and wiped it over her lips and cheek, before doing the same to Elijah, ignoring his objections. As she stuffed the tissue back into her pocket, she caught the quick flash of impatience on the man's face. I need a police officer to investigate my mother's disappearance. He gave a slow shake of his head. That's not how it works, madam. She shifted Elijah again, a little peeved with his use of the word madam. It grated. I don't understand. I've just told you my mum is missing. Yes, he nodded. So I'm going to take some details from you first, and then we'll see if you want to report this. I do want to report it. Panic rose in her chest. For God's sake, why wasn't he taking her seriously? Why else would she be there? He pushed the glasses up his nose and returned his attention to the screen. The reflection of white light bounced from his lenses, so she could no longer see his eyes, but she assumed they were intent on reading whatever it was he had tapped into the computer. She'd given her name and her mum's name so far, and date of birth, just her mum's. Address? Mine? He sighed. Yes, to start with. She reeled off her address and then waited in painful silence as he entered it onto the computer. Taking so long, Lorraine had to shift the baby from one hip to the other and regretted not carrying Elijah in his car seat. She'd wanted the comfort, his small body pressed against hers. A telephone rang at the back of the compact room, sharp and persistent until it jangled on her nerves. And your mum's address? His glasses flashed a reflection of light as he glanced up and then back down again. Lorraine almost ground her teeth as the phone in the background continued to shrill. Pardon? Address. He raised his voice. Your mum's address. She raised a hand and brushed a lock of hair back from Elijah's forehead. Do you want to get that? Her voice came out, a waspish snap to match his, and the clerk raised his head in jerky surprise. His glasses slipped down his nose again, so sharp blue eyes pinned her with disapproval. No, I can only deal with one task at a time. Lucky for you, yours is my priority. Someone else will get that one. His lips pinched tight. Now, madam, shall we continue? Mrs. Pengelly. Sorry? That's okay. She forced a smile. But it's Mrs. Pengelly, not madam. Madam inferred that she'd not given him her name, and she had, as soon as she walked through the front door of the station. It may have been in a breathy gush, but she'd given it. He should at least have the courtesy to acknowledge who she was. And you are... He gave a slow blink, evidently taken aback by her attitude. Perhaps he was used to outright aggression or sobbing victims. She was neither. She simply wanted someone to find her mum, but here she was talking to a clerk, not a police officer. She gave Elijah a comforting pat on the back without taking her eyes off the man behind the security glass. Mark Hearn. He pushed his glasses up with his middle finger. Shall we get on with this? A woman walked into the office behind him, and the phone stopped ringing with an abruptness that brought nothing but relief. Lorraine nodded. "Your mum's address, please, Mrs. Pengelly." He stressed the last two words. 34 Westacre Drive, Ketley Bank. Her jaw tightened as he input the address with painful slowness, but she held her tongue. He stopped typing and glanced up. "What makes you think your mum is missing?" "I told you." Admittedly, it had been a panicked garble as she walked through the automatic doors, fear in her heart. "She telephoned me last night. She was panicky, like something bad was about to happen. Then I went around this morning and she wasn't there. It was all very odd." Mark Hearn took his hands from the keyboard and gave her a direct stare. "Could she have gone to the shops?" Lorraine's face stiffened. He didn't believe her. There was something not right. How could she explain? She knew in her heart that something had happened to her mum, but how did she portray that to this man? "I went there this morning and something wasn't right. The place seemed..." The man's steely eyebrow raised. "Empty?" "Yes." He'd nailed it. Even when her mum wasn't there, the house had never felt empty, but it had this morning. "Is your mum registered as vulnerable?" "No." But she was vulnerable. She had been, ever since Lorraine's dad had died. "She's sad. A little depressed since my dad died." She didn't want to make it sound as though her mum had something wrong with her. Surely she only needed to tell him information that was relevant. "Her GP prescribed antidepressants," she blurted. He gave a nod. "And how long do you believe she's been missing?" Lorraine frowned as she took Elijah's fingers from her mouth again. "She phoned me early this morning in a state, almost 3:30. Mark Hearn gave a slow nod. "And you didn't go around at that point?" Everything about the man epitomised stiff disapproval, as though he considered she should have rushed around at the time to check on her mum, the very moment she'd put the phone down on her, that it was her responsibility. Guilt gnawed at her. It was. She wished she had, and now she had this man judging her. "No, I couldn't leave my children." He slipped a glance over Elijah. "Your partner at work?" Heat slid over her cheeks as she held onto her son's hand. "No. My husband left us last year. I couldn't leave my children." "And you didn't feel at that time it was urgent enough to call the police?" She squeezed her eyes shut for a brief moment and then looked at him again. It was bad enough she was riddled with guilt, without him making her feel like a foolish moron. "Look, this is not normal for my mum. She's disappeared. I'm telling you, I don't know where she is." "But she called you last night in a state, and you were unable to go around." He held his hands, palms out to her. "I'm just being devil's advocate here. When she called, had she been drinking?" "No." "Yes. I don't know." "So, your mum called you last night. She may have been drinking. She's on medication. You couldn't get there, so she called someone else," he suggested. "She went to a friend's place. She woke up this morning and met someone for coffee and a chat. Maybe she feels foolish, selfish for waking you in the middle of the night, and she's not yet ready to face you." Frustration rolled in her chest. He didn't understand. Her mum was panic-stricken when she phoned, frightened. She didn't have friends. She spent most of her time with Lorraine and the children. Her circle of friends was not a circle. Lorraine could barely remember her mum ever mentioning anyone. She'd been a devoted wife, mother and grandmother. Most of her time had been with family. "Look." He leaned on the counter, to bring himself closer to the partition between them, his face softening with understanding. Or so he thought. Your mum is an adult. She has every right to have her own friends and do her own thing. No, but Mrs. Pengelly. His tone stopped her dead. Your mum is probably perfectly safe. There will be a logical explanation. After her phone call last night, she probably realised that you have your hands full. He stared pointedly at Elijah and decided to find someone a little less busy. Someone with time to listen. How could she explain that she and her mum had such a close relationship? They weren't just mum and daughter. They were best friends, even closer since Lorraine's dad had died and her husband had left her. They were inseparable. It was hard to conceive her mum would have gone elsewhere. She didn't have that many friends. Look. Sympathetic eyes stared at her from over his glasses. Here's my advice. Go home. Ring your mum. Don't run yourself ragged by spinning around in circles. Be logical, implying she hadn't been so far. Make a list of her friends and ring them. Check the places she would normally go. She may have just wanted to get away. Take a break from everything. Perhaps it's all got a bit much and she needs some thinking time. Think of where she might stay overnight. For comfort, solace. Somewhere maybe your dad used to go with her. She may just want to be alone. How could she explain their relationship to a man who evidently didn't have a clue? I know my mum. She wouldn't. Grief can make people act in strange ways. Change them. That's what I'm concerned about. She said some really strange things. Something about a brother. Your brother? She shook her head. I don't have a brother. Your mum's brother? No. She said she was in danger. He was coming to get her. Who? My brother. He lowered his chin. But you don't have one. She sounded scared. Crazy. And this was around about 3:30 this morning, yes? Yes. You mentioned she's on medication, and she'd been drinking. I'll bet she feels dreadful, guilty that she woke you. It sounds like she mixed booze and drugs and had a bouncer of a nightmare. No. Yes. Oh, I don't know, Mark. I just know she was frantic and I couldn't go around. He let out a sigh and gave her a pitying smile. And you feel guilty because you weren't available to dash to your mum's side. He tapped at the keyboard again and lifted his fingers with a quick flourish, as though he'd just typed the end. I'm sure there'll be a perfectly logical explanation once your mum turns up. In my experience, there nearly always is. The doors behind her slid open to let a gaggle of loud teenagers and a sharp gust of wind in. Frustrated with the barrier this man had raised between her and a real police officer, and the interruption, she clenched her jaw. So, you're not going to investigate? She could barely hear his reply as the kids' chatter rose to hysterical proportions. She heard the words shoplift and nick as she waited for the counter clerk to reply. All she wanted was to get out of there, get away from them all. Didn't they realise she had a real problem, possibly a crime? Not that she had any evidence. She could see his point, but she was reluctant to acknowledge it. Look, I've put your mum on the system just to save time. Give it a couple of days and I'm sure she'll turn up. Unless you consider she's at risk. He paused. His grey eyebrows rose into a crinkled forehead. Is she at risk? Well, was she? Filled with self-doubt, and a foolish feeling that her mum was going to wonder what the hell she was doing, Lorraine gave a mute shake of her head. Her eyes stung with the hot tears she held back. Mark Hearn's voice turned gentle. "She'll be fine. Believe me, we have this kind of thing happen all the time." She clenched her teeth. "And how many do you find a week later face down in a ditch?" A wince passed over his face, but she was beyond caring. Lorraine backed up, almost swallowed by the group of kids. She gave a nod and turned away, horrified at her own rudeness. She cuddled Elijah tight as the kids, oblivious to her, barely left a gap to let her squeeze through. The cold hit her as she stepped through the door and drew in a breath of fresh air she'd not realised she was craving. He was wrong. Her mum wasn't coming back. Lorraine knew it, felt it in the depths of her soul. Chapter 7. 31 years earlier. Sandra pushed the door to the nursery open with one finger and let it swing wide. Weak autumn sunshine fought to cast a pale finger of light through the narrow break in the curtain across the darkened room. A room Henry had poured his heart and soul into decorating, ready for the new arrival. As they'd not known the sex of the baby, he'd decorated it in a beautiful pastel wallpaper they'd chosen together. Sweet baby elephants blowing trumpets of rainbows across the wall. She approached the cot, her gaze skimming over the white rotary anglaise sheet that had been thrown back.